I'm Bill L. Smith. I'm the director of the Borah Foundation, which partners quite effectively, I think, with the Borah Committee, which plans the annual symposium. And I have the honor of welcoming you to the joint production of a Borah program and a Renfrew Colloquium. This marks the 12th year that we've done this together rather than programming separately, and it's been a nice and fruitful partnership as two of the premier lecture series on campus get together. I'm really here to acknowledge that and then introduce Sadid Ahsan, who's one of the members of the Borah Committee, who will introduce today's program. I'd also like to tell you how Q&A will work. So when Professor Darnton finishes his remarks, we will have the microphone turned on here in the front, and we'll run that formally until 1:20, which is the time that we're committed to end, so that folks who need to get to a 1:30 class can do so, but then we'll still be around for a few minutes after that to answer follow-up or further questions on a more one-to-one basis. Sadid.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Borah Symposium and the Renfrew Colloquium. My name is Sadid Ahsan and I'm a student member of the Borah Committee, and it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Christopher Darnton. Dr. Darnton is an associate professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and an affiliate of Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. His work examines the domestic and bureaucratic politics of foreign policy in the Americas, particularly related to enduring rivalries and regional wars, conflict resolution and public diplomacy, developing country diplomacy in the Cold War and contemporary great power competition, and the refinement of archival and case study research methods in security studies. He's the author of Rivalry and Alliance Politics in Cold War Latin America, and is currently writing a book on the 100-year history of U.S. security cooperation in the Americas. Please help me welcome Dr. Darnton to the podium.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you guys very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. I'm Chris Darnton from Naval Postgraduate School. And as a federal government employee, I will give the obligatory disclaimer that the things I'm about to say represent my own work and my own opinions, and I'll take all of the blame and flack and questions you would like, but they don't speak for the Defense Department. So 2024, where we are now, is a really fraught but vital moment for considering American alliances around the world. Whether Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan, many US allies and partners are either under attack, at war, or readying for threats that may come over the horizon. Moreover, as everyone knows, this is a presidential election year, which raises big questions about America's role in the world and the direction that our country wishes to head. Public opinion polling is a really good way to track a lot of those issues. These aren't my polls. I'll pull from the Chicago Council. One finding, this is earlier this summer, surveys do suggest that the US public sees alliances as perhaps the #1 tool that we have for achieving our foreign policy objectives around the world. On the other hand, same survey, surveys suggest that US public support for American engagement around the world, for a US positive role in having any foreign policy objectives at all, has been trending downward for about the last decade, and in fact is bouncing off of some post-Vietnam War lows. And of course, there's partisan divides over this as well, although these fluctuate depending on who's occupying the White House. So right now, I would say, as a society, we're increasingly ambivalent, really doubtful in foreign affairs, and that affects how other countries around the world perceive us, both our friends and foes. And it raises big questions about the reliability and trustworthiness of US commitments, even to our NATO allies under Article 5. So I want to talk about sustaining American alliances. I want to talk about why they matter and how to build those partnerships and what some of the consequences are. So first of all, do robust alliances matter, right? What are the consequences of having forward U.S. security commitments? Well, one possibility is we're living in a world of the domino theory. Right? We're living in a world where threats are interdependent and where U.S. choices to follow through on red lines and alliance promises affect interactions elsewhere. So a lot of commentary on U.S. needs to stand up in Ukraine, otherwise it will embolden the People's Republic of China to make a move on Taiwan. So there's a domino theory world that our behavior matters and we have to stand up for our allies. There's another possibility, which is that actually our alliance choices don't matter that much because this is just a world of material power and capability, and so deterrence will be effective almost irrespective of how we behave. There's a third possibility, which is that actually standing up for allies can make the world more dangerous, and I'll talk about this in a minute. These are really long-standing concerns. A lot of the things that we're worrying about in 2024, in fact, go back to our entire experience through the 20th century. So that historical experience has a lot to teach us about the importance of American alliances. Globally, the aftermath of the First World War produced some opposing sets of lessons. So in the interwar period in the 1920s and into the 1930s, there was a huge emphasis on international law and diplomacy. On the higher education side, this is the genesis of many professional schools of international affairs, trying to use innovation and research and teaching to prevent another cataclysm like the Great War. This led to, among other things, efforts such as what the Borah Foundation puts as the outlawry of war. So building a diplomatic and legal architecture to prevent conflict. We do know that laws and treaties alone do not prevent conflict. There needs to be enforcement mechanisms. You can use arms limitation talks, arbitration, mediation, some kind of crisis response machinery to kick into gear and create regional and global governance. A lot of that post-World War I emphasis on building international institutions sprang from a fear or worry about the risks of international alliances. And I'll flag at least 4 and then try to make a more positive case for why alliances are helpful. Things you would worry about by having international alliances. First of all, there's guilt by association. This is the not in our name phenomenon. A lot of this comes up when looking at the use of US supplied weapons in the war in Yemen, for example. So if you have an ally and that ally does things you don't agree with, are you somehow tarred with that brush of partnership? A second possibility is chain ganging or emboldenment, where think about US strategic ambiguity historically with respect to our partnership with Taiwan. If you offer too much of a security guarantee to a country, does it get secure enough to do something aggressive that it otherwise might not do? A third possible problem is conflict spirals or provocation. This comes up a lot with NATO expansion, and it's one offered story about Russian aggression in Ukraine, which is if the US builds a lot of new alliances and partnerships, instead of deterring an adversary, does it actually spook and provoke that adversary into doing something aggressive, and you wind up with an avoidable conflict. And lastly, one historical concern about US alliances is the question of overstretch and burden. So think about the Soviet Union's alliances and partnerships, especially in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. Our alliance is just expensive, right? Is this a waste of resources, and does it undermine American national security? But what I want to suggest is this is not necessarily an either or, that either we're living in a world of law and peace or we're living in a world of force and war and alliances. Rather, international institutions do matter for helping shape a peaceful and more secure world, and international law is part of that. You can think about, international organizations, League of Nations, later the United Nations as most significantly as part of this. But I want to suggest that even narrower alliances and regional collective security pacts can be part of this too. And partly that's because alliances do a lot of stuff. They perform a wide range of functions. This is not just about joint preparation for combined warfighting. Alliances do all sorts of things. There's external deterrence, but also internal collective security, internal dispute resolution and solidarity, and that requires organization and often bureaucracy and a whole lot of meetings and paperwork. Just as a point of reference, NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, had once quipped, this is a useful quote for any international relations majors, that NATO was created, quote, to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in and the Germans down. Now, only a third of that is actually about externally facing deterrence of adversaries. 2/3 of it is about managing our relationships with our friends and partners. Right? That's a huge part of what alliances are for. This is not just a NATO issue, and it's not just about the US security commitment to Europe. The region that I'm most expert in, that I study, is Latin America, our relations with our partners in Central and South America. In 1947, President Truman goes to Rio de Janeiro and reaches diplomatically the Rio Treaty. Formerly, this is the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. This is still on the books, although some countries have recently departed from it, and the foundation of the Organization of American States the following year in 1948. There are lots of provisions in the treaty. I'm not expecting anyone's going to read a slide of a long document, so I'll just highlight the important parts. The Rio Treaty, as with NATO, has a lot of provisions about emergency consultations if something goes wrong, and conflict resolution among the allies and partners. I'll just highlight one passage from the preamble, that the obligation of mutual assistance and common defense of the American republics is essentially related to their democratic ideals and their will to cooperate permanently in the fulfillment of the principles and purposes of a policy of peace. If you want a more peaceful world and you care about sovereignty and diplomacy, actually collective security pacts can help that. Bottom line, I want to argue, alliances are part of international governance and the architecture of global peace and security. I have a lot of history slides, but I'll try to weave in some contemporary policy discussion. When we talk about contemporary US alliances, what do we mean? How many do we have? Where are they? What have we signed up for? And it's quite a lot. Actually, this slide from Washington Post from 2014 needs to be updated in a few places, but it gives you a picture, right? From the Rio Treaty and the Organization of American States, we have partnerships with almost all, put some asterisks on things, of Latin America. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of course, is the granddaddy, NATO. And NATO has been expanding after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO expands into the former communist states in Eastern Europe, later adds some former Soviet states, and most recently, post Russia's invasion of Ukraine beyond Crimea, Finland and Sweden. Right. Finland, top left. Additionally, beyond those broader alliances, the United States has a number of bilateral alliances and partnerships, and we have a category called major non-NATO allies. It starts in the 1980s, but we've been gradually proliferating these. So President Obama adds Tunisia during the Arab Spring era as a major non-NATO ally for the United States. President Trump added Brazil as a major non-NATO ally in 2019. And the Biden administration has added 3, Colombia, Qatar, and most recently Kenya, which is taking a leading role for peacekeeping operation in Haiti. Further, big news on alliance reshuffling, starting in 2021, is the AUKUS agreement. Now, obviously, Australia and the United Kingdom were already long-standing allies and partners of the United States, but this is a new institution. Note the submarine in the background. That's a really important part of all of this. The idea that we're going to be working with the Australians to provide nuclear-powered submarines, and also that this AUKUS partnership is going to help everybody integrate in a high-tech way to build advanced capabilities for common defense. Beyond that, we have a galaxy of security partnerships. There's a few different ways to track that. You could look at what are the countries to which the US exports weapon systems, so one thing you could map. Another way is just by looking at personnel. Where do we have troops or forward deployed military units? And this is sort of a density map. So we have a lot of US military personnel in Japan and South Korea and Germany for longstanding historical reasons. But the really interesting part of this is the light blue. The light blue says we have at least somebody. We might have 5 or 12 military personnel in country X, and it's almost everywhere in the world with some gaps. So that's what I'm increasingly interested in, right, is this lower level of U.S. security assistance and partnership building, which goes way beyond NATO, and in fact commits us at some level to helping the majority of countries on the planet. So let's back up for a minute. Why are we doing this? What's the point? Why does the U.S. do this, and why do other countries participate in security partnerships with the United States? That's a super academic question. So what do we know in international relations about the drivers of alliances and cooperation? We do know a few things, or we've learned a few things. First of all, there is a realist story that politics makes strange bedfellows, and that there's a limited convergence of interest. The enemy of my enemy is my friend temporarily. So the classic example of this is the US alliance with Uncle Joe Stalin's Soviet Union during the Second World War. It works when everybody's fighting against the Nazis, and it stops working once both sides have occupied portions of Germany. And so this is a world of balancing and bandwagoning. If you are a small state living near the Russian periphery, you have a choice to make that you are going to be with or against the Russians, and there's not a whole lot of maneuver space. For the United States, for the past couple of decades, security partnerships and alliances have been a way of burden shifting to frontline allies. So during both the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, there was an emphasis on finding counterterrorism and counterinsurgent frontline partners to wage a war somewhere else so that it would not be fought here. And this leads to, we need to focus on our core threats and our major adversaries, and we're willing to work with anybody else in a limited way to make that happen. One refreshing point about that realist worldview is, thinking back to George Washington's farewell address and warning of entangling alliances. In a really realist world, alliances don't entangle you that much because you can always just walk away. Some problems with this limited, threat-driven realist worldview. First of all, most security partnerships do not really affect the balance of power. Most of the states on the globe that we have partnerships with do not have aircraft carriers or nuclear-powered submarines or space capabilities or any of the other, or army divisions that would affect the balance of power in a conflict scenario. Nonetheless, so what that means is there's a lot more security partnership out there than the threat of war can really explain. Further, we know that alliances are sticky, and they often outlast the threats that helped create them in the first place. NATO is a really good example. Between the end of the Cold War, circa 1991, and 2022, with Russia's incursion into eastern Ukraine, if the Soviet Union has collapsed, why do we still need NATO? This was a huge puzzle, but the fact that it stuck around suggests it's doing other things for member states than just deterring the other Moscow. So also, sometimes states under-cooperate. They have a common enemy, they have a shared threat, and yet there's less cooperation than we might expect in a realist worldview. This was one of the puzzles that I looked at in my first book, which is looking at U.S. partnerships in Latin America during the Cold War, and especially looking at how our nominal allies related to one another. It turned out, even among a set of countries that had shared interests, that were all on the Western side of the Cold War, that had concerns about communism, that doesn't mean everybody had a high level of solidarity and partnership with one another, and often regional rivalries and conflicts got in the way of team effort. And a lot of the reasons for that had to do with the hurdles of domestic politics. Even if there's a common threat, you have to get stakeholders on board. There can be bureaucratic or partisan obstacles to working with a former adversary. And that gets us thinking about domestic preferences and state institutions. And in international relations, we tend to call this liberalism, obligatory flag. That has almost nothing to do with liberal versus conservative in American political circles. In liberal international relations circles, there is an argument that democracies do not go to war with one another. And in fact, that democracies have a lot in common and are more likely to form alliances, trade with one another, and have a productive partnership. This informed the Clinton administration's democratic enlargement national security strategy in the 1990s, and at different times, both the Biden administration and the George W. Bush administration have talked about building an alliance of democracies, right? A kind of freedom agenda. Liberalism also tells us the importance of international level institutions. Formal alliance commitments do matter. They may not be ironclad, they may not force states to do things, but making those promises does shift our behavior. It helps us lock in partnerships and commitments and ties our hands a little bit. Some problems, though, with the idea that democratic cooperation and domestic politics are going to drive alliance choices. First of all, in a democracy, people disagree, and elections have consequences. So public opinion swings. US might shift from being more engaged to more isolationist. It's not always the case that democracies get along perfectly well with one another. The US-French relationship is case in point. Furthermore, some forms of dictatorship or authoritarian regimes can cooperate in a limited fashion quite well. And the US has had a long tradition of working with what the Reagan administration called unsavory partners, that not all US allies are always paragons of democracy, transparency, and human rights. We often have worked with dictatorial, human rights abusing, and corrupt regimes, which is really hard to square with American values, what we preach, and sometimes it resonates more clearly with our underlying hard-nosed interests about geopolitics or energy. So one thing that international relations liberalism and a focus on domestic politics tells us is it can be harder to get a partnership than you think just based on the level of external threat. But if you can find a way to get that buy-in and lock it in domestically, it helps you have an enduring partnership that's unlikely to dissipate when the threat goes away. Well, if neither a shared threat nor having the same domestic constitutional makeup really drives alliance solidarity, then where does it come from? How do you get a lasting international partnership? Is it possible that your preferences or your identity as an ally or an adversary isn't fixed? That allies aren't born, rather they are made. If you're having a conversation with policy practitioners, this is where you'd want to bring up questions like public diplomacy and whether it works trying to build influence abroad. You might talk in a more military audience about shaping. In a political science class, though, you do get bonus points by framing this as a question about endogenous preferences. That's the last time I'll mention endogeneity today. On these issues of building alliance and partnership, I'm essentially becoming kind of a reluctant constructivist, being dragged there against my will. Research means learning and changing your beliefs, and professors are lifelong students too. We change our minds in light of evidence and facts. And one thing that I'm coming to learn about how alliances work is that interactions shape identities and preferences. They can create convergence of interest. They build trust and confidence. So alliance solidarity is not automatic. It has to be earned and continually re-earned. A threat matters. A treaty can help, but you have to act like those things are important for them to take effect. The US special relationship with the United Kingdom is a case in point. It's a great photo, FDR and Churchill. It was not automatic or did not come down on stone tablets that the US and Britain were going to be best friends forever. In fact, we spent most of the first century after United States independence with Great Britain as our #1 national security threat. We waged multiple wars, we prepared for additional wars that didn't happen, and by the late 19th century, this all changed. And it was not simply because of external threats from France or Germany, and it was not simply because the US and Britain were both increasingly democratic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Rather, we figured out how to act like allies, and that was a gradual process. That process is what I'm working on in my current book project, which, as Sadid mentioned, is looking at the long history of U.S. military engagement in Latin America, so south of our border. Yes, there have been armed interventions, especially the age of gunboat diplomacy, the early 20th century in the Caribbean basin. But a lot of what I'm interested in is, what has the U.S. military been doing in our home region of the Americas when we're not invading anybody? What do we do the rest of the time? And the answer is helping. Not just formal treaty allies and not just in acute threat circumstances like post-Pearl Harbor, the ramp up to World War II, but consistently over the long term and comprehensively using a wide range of tools. Over the past century or so, U.S. naval and military officers have developed a really extensive toolkit for building cooperation with partners. This has ranged from things like providing military equipment, weapons, ships, aircraft, down to little things. In the photo in the lower left here, this is a Marine major in Brazil who creatively used some Lend-Lease authorities to get 6 rifles, that's the targets in the background, provided to the Brazilian Marine Corps to train them how to be sharpshooters. Brazilians gave him a medal for it. Little things. Beyond weapons, UNITAS naval exercises, which are a tremendous effort multinationally across the hemisphere. So the photo on the right, this is 1965, U.S. destroyer operating with Colombian ships. Education, training, from full-time schoolhouses to personnel exchanges to temporary mobile training teams. There's a continual engagement and a forward presence. Think back to the map I showed you with where are U.S. troops around the world, and almost everywhere is light blue. So what's the day job of the men and women stationed in that country, right? And it's using a lot of these tools to build cooperation. And a lot of that is in a liaison officer sort of way, whether it's aboard ship or having an officer exchange in a military command structure. It's just being there and listening. Figuring out what our friends and partners want, figuring out how to advance U.S. interests, and looking for mutually supportive solutions. How to study all of this involves a lot of archival digging through the paper trail in a variety of places. I have been for several years trying to track down this history of what the U.S. has been doing to figure out how to do security partnerships and alliances in Latin America with declassified military documents from a range of services and commands. I'm not going to get in the weeds with documents today, but archival research is really near and dear to my heart. This is what I do for fun when I'm not teaching. So mostly what I want to highlight is a few of the big takeaways, the lessons from this work, in the process of writing the second book. Lessons about the why and the how of U.S. security cooperation. So is there U.S. self-interest at play? Are we doing this not because we're altruists? Yes, that's true. We care about regional stability, peace, and security, partly because as a superpower with global interests, we need to focus on other places. You cannot have the same level of energy devoted to 200 sovereign countries in the world. And if you're concerned about the Eastern Mediterranean or the Western Pacific, it sure would be nice if the Caribbean were not on fire or being hit by hurricanes or racked by narco-trafficking violence. Right? So regional stability frees up other U.S. assets, not least of which is high-level senior decision-maker attention to focus on problems elsewhere. Second, we do care about the U.S. economy, which involves access to markets and trade partners and materials, and so building allies and partners is good for our economy at home. We care about how even small countries align with the U.S. or against the United States with U.S. adversaries. This has been true for a long time. And historically, we care about the Panama Canal for a range of reasons. But one thing that is striking to me, setting aside the hardcore self-interest aspect, with a really long time horizon, a century or more, it's interesting to me to watch presidents come and go, policy objectives come and go, the threat and problem of the day and the current news cycle ebbs and flows, whether that's Nazi Germany, whether it's Soviet communist inroads into the Western Hemisphere, whether it's narco-trafficking is the #1 problem, and then there was the global war on terrorism, and now it's all China, all the time. But in a century-long time window, you see these things rise and fall, and yet the mission doesn't change, really. The day job for U.S. embassies and U.S. forces is largely to cooperate, to work with partners to help build their capabilities so that they can solve the problems that they have prioritized, and for us to sustain a productive working relationship with the United States through military channels. That was surprising to me. And sometimes that meant we're willing to work with repressive military juntas, even though we know that activists are being disappeared, for example, or that there's been outbreaks of torture. We sometimes have worked with authoritarian partners. That is absolutely true. But one thing that leaps off of the paper trail with me is usually that was not the goal as understood by U.S. forces working with those countries. Rather, we push cooperation almost everywhere, almost all the time, whether it's a democracy or whether it's a dictatorship looking for mutual interests and advancement. We're sort of standing together in sickness and in health, basically. Now there's challenges, right? This sort of cooperation and alliance building doesn't work super well if you have conflicting messages on social media or TV coming out of US domestic politics. It doesn't work really well if the US gets super coercive and starts strong-arming. That's not how to act like an ally. Historical memories are really long. It is hard to build cooperation and alliance in a country where you previously did some coercive things, even if it was before you were born, but where agents of the United States did some coercive things. So the US has a lot of repair work to do, has to walk the walk. And one thing that comes out of that archival trail of looking at how long US forces have been trying to do these sorts of things in such a wide range of countries and governments and a wide range of geopolitical conditions is it says there's a deep historical root for what US Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, based in Miami. This is the Geographic Combatant Command with an area of responsibility focused on Latin America, except for Mexico, which is under NORTHCOM, and I don't want to get sidetracked in DoD bureaucracy. But U.S. Southern Command, one of its highest priorities, one of its mantras for a quarter century, has been that the United States is and should be the partner of choice for Latin America. And I love that framing because it helps remind us that the partner gets a choice on whether to work with us or not. In Latin America and in much of Africa, the term of art is agency, that all countries, including the smallest, has agency and is not going to be dictated to or strong-armed by even nuclear-armed great powers, which means we cannot take partnership and alliance for granted. And we are unlikely to agree with our partners on all issues and decisions. So cooperation will require persuasion and patience. What does that mean for U.S. foreign policy? It means we often need to wait, to weather the storms, to commit for the long haul, to persist, to do the small things where that are possible, and take advantage of small wins. And it also means we need to share and live up to our own doctrine and values for good or ill. Another key implication of this is that building alliances and partnerships is personal and is often done by individuals serving a long ways from home in forward positions. Do not just think of international relations as the grand strategic chessboard. Also be suspicious of any book that has a chessboard on the cover because it tells you the author is strategic. I could flip back to my book, which does have a globe on the cover. You also want to be suspicious of books that have globes on the cover because it tells you how internationally savvy the author is. Anyway. But international politics is not just the grand strategic chessboard, and it's not just the globe and geopolitics. The personal is political, right? To borrow the slogan from the late 60s and 70s. So what can the U.S. do to be an effective partner and ally around the world? Well, while recognizing that alliances are multifaceted, whole-of-government relationships, and there are huge roles for diplomacy and commerce and a wide range of U.S. stakeholders, I'm going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to set it aside because the part that I want to focus on is the security cooperation side, and especially the military-to-military relationship that the United States has with allies and partners. As a tool for building regional stability and enhancing citizen security, as a channel for trust and influence for the United States. And whether we have an alliance treaty or not, or even if it's more of an informal partnership, we have an opportunity to act like allies. This all matters at home as well, not just abroad, especially in a democracy. And if any of the poli-sci folks want to ask about democracy versus republic, we can have that conversation. But alliances should not be left to the Department of State and the Department of Defense, right? We live in a democracy and public opinion matters a great deal for our partnerships in the world. There is a public role. It is often said that US citizens do not vote based on foreign policy or defense policy, but public rhetoric and support, or conversely public apathy about these issues, has consequences for what our government chooses to do, for what it is constrained from doing, and for how our allies and our adversaries perceive our interests and our sincerity and our commitments. We have accountability and oversight. Congress exerts oversight on the executive branch, including for military and diplomatic issues, but Congress exerts those pressures when citizens exert their pressures on Congress. I will also point, in an effort to bring all of this back home for a bit, when I go overseas and I talk with former students and others serving in US embassies abroad, I ask about these different tools. You know, what are we doing to build partnerships? What are the areas of friction? What does the partner want that we've been unable to deliver? What are we trying to push and we can't seem to get partners and allies to agree and get on board? So what are the friction points? How are these negotiations working? What tools do you have at your disposal? And one of the common refrains that I hear in a range of countries, one of the most effective tools for US military-to-military cooperation is the National Guard, which among other things has a state partnership program. So prior to Russian incursion in Ukraine in 2022, when the US pulls out personnel from embassy and other entities, one of the last units we had in Ukraine doing security cooperation was the Florida National Guard. The Idaho Army National Guard has a state partnership program as well. It's with Cambodia. Now, the Guard website currently has an asterisk by this one and lists it as dormant. There are some issues in the US-Cambodia bilateral relationship. I'm not an East Asia expert, but the issues that have been flagged right now, the US expresses concern over democracy and human rights, or backsliding on those issues, and especially about the increasing People's Republic of China presence and influence, including Chinese use of the naval base at Ream in Southeast Asia. But if there's a break in the ice, if there's a pause in the action, if and when opportunity permits for the US to push our values and build international partnerships in, if you read the National Security Strategy, an age of strategic competition in Southeast Asia, when that window or door opens a little bit with Cambodia, a lot of Idaho citizens are going to get the call to participate in exactly that channel. This photo has to go back. I had to reach back a few years to get a photo op. This hasn't been done the last few years. This is 2019. But what I like about this is literal bridge building. That's what they were doing the last time they were there, was working with Cambodian forces who are going to be assigned on UN peacekeeping missions to learn how to build portable bridges and cross rivers. Last couple minutes here. Why should we care? Why should US citizens care about all this, and what's in it for us? I've tried to talk about what the US can do for our allies and partners for global peace and security, from peacekeeping to deterrence, but I do want to conclude by thinking about what alliances do for the United States more directly, not just as a factor for global security, but these partnerships do enhance American national security in a few key ways. First of all, allies have our back. There is a security dimension of all this, and I mean even small allies. You look at World War II, a lot of what mattered was doing convoy operations across the Atlantic to support the British and other European partners. That requires everybody watching out for U-boats, and so we trained the Cubans, the Colombians, the Brazilians on how to use naval air assets and surface assets to do operations against the U-boat threat. Small allies can often provide access, basing, intelligence sharing, overflight rights, and also allies give us legitimacy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So yes, allies contribute, and even small allies contribute to American national security, especially in a war scenario. Second, allies and partners make us more productive. We tend to trade and interact economically with our security partners. That helps reduce everybody's burdens. It gives us a division of labor. And also, in a largely capitalist economy, innovation comes from that level of economic exchange. I showed the AUKUS slide earlier. Part of the AUKUS partnership is about nuclear submarines, but pillar 2 for AUKUS is how are we going to build high-end new technologies in the defense sector? And Britain's not going to do that in a vacuum. Australia's not going to do that in a vacuum. And even the United States is not going to do that in a vacuum. We will work better by investing and cooperating with our partners. So that all has huge economic benefits for us. And lastly, and I'll tie this back to the constructivist thread that I've been weaving in this talk, allies and partners help make us our best self. They help keep us honest. They remind us to express and live up to our values and call us on it when we act inconsistently with our stated values. These alliances and partnerships push us to articulate and to keep our promises in world affairs. And so, thinking back to the early days of global war on terrorism, the argument that, if you're not with us, you're with the terrorists. If you're not with us, you're against us. We can sort of turn that slogan on its head a bit and say, if they're not with us, maybe we're going the wrong way. If nobody follows you, you're not a leader, okay? Can't be a leader in your own mind. The coalition of the willing was often derided during the George W. Bush years, but if you don't have a coalition, how legitimate is it really what you're doing? So it forces us to be honest with ourselves. I mean, at some level, every alliance is a coalition of the willing, because you can always walk away, even when there's formal commitments in place. It's the follow-through and the recommitment that matters. So in international relations constructivist terms, it's worth thinking about habits and practices and how to turn an alliance from a formal treaty into a lived ongoing experience. So foreign policy involves self-improvement as well as mutual confidence building. And if you can learn to trust your allies and partners, if you can respect and listen even to weaker states who disagree with you, that might improve your ability to interact and negotiate even with your adversaries. So I want to suggest that a robust alliance is a long-term relationship, and it's actually a lot like a marriage. I've been thinking about this analogy a lot. So to conclude, I want to argue American alliances can and ought to be a force for good in the world, a united front not just of common interests, but of shared values and experiences, that those strong relationships directly help and benefit the United States, but also that sustaining those alliances requires commitment. It requires daily engagement on a personal level and recognition that it's a two-way street, that listening and cooperation and compromise are going to matter, and there will probably be a fair amount of friction on the way to something that looks like happily ever after, or at least as close as we're likely to get in international relations. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to hang out as long as we have time and take questions.
Well, if no one else will go, I'll go ahead and kick us off first.
Please.
So you kind of talked about how you've become almost like a reluctant constructivist. And we've been going over those main three theories of international relations in my international politics class. And I was kind of wondering, how do other countries see changes in like our main foreign policy outlook through those kind of different lenses, if that makes any sense at all?
Great. Let me unplug two pieces of that, I think, right? So one is whether decision makers actually see the world through our theories and concepts? And probably most of the time the answer is no. And that's okay. So I don't want to get sidetracked in arguing about the recently departed Henry Kissinger. But it doesn't matter like whether Kissinger is or was a realist. As an analyst, as a researcher, as a student, does a particular theory help us understand and explain and make sense of what that decision maker is doing, even if the decision maker has never heard of the theory, right? If we can do those things, it's a useful tool. Let me get back to the second point, which is how other countries see us. Having taught intro international relations many times, different institutions, different levels, there's a lot more arguments and theories out there than the realism, liberalism, constructivism breakdown, which is often a starting point for the way we're going to teach this. But if you ask the Turks, the Brazilians, the Chileans, the Danish, there are a wide range of theoretical schools or approaches that other countries have that we often, as Americans, we just can't cover it in fall semester. Right? There's only so much reading we can realistically throw at you. But there are lenses that other countries use that we're less familiar with. So probably as leaders and analysts in other countries are making sense of the United States, they are using a toolkit that we may be less familiar with. So especially if you want to focus on a particular bilateral relationship with the British, or for that matter, the Russians, the Chinese, it very much behooves us to try to look at that relationship the way that they see it, which involves learning not just literally their language, but their set of theories and concepts. And that's hard.
Awesome.
Great question.
Thank you.
Sure.
I know you have a big focus on Latin America, so I just want to ask, throughout the Cold War, there were a bunch of special clandestine activities in Latin America, and especially going forward, I feel like that's a big focal point for U.S. relations. We may have forgotten, but they haven't. So what sort of framework going forward should the U.S. adopt to address that, and what's sort of the Latin American perspective where some of those activities were really consequential to their domestic history and politics?
Okay. Right. So I've been trying to paint the story with flashlights and bright spots, and now you want us to zoom in on the dark spots, which is good. We should do some of that. Some things that we can do differently. First of all, a lot of my students are U.S. military officers, especially foreign area officers, who are going to serve on a staff or at a fleet command, or they're going to be in a U.S. embassy. So one of the things that I try to push in class is we need to learn that history, warts and all, so you are not at a strategic and communicative disadvantage when you go to another country. Some of that is about covert operations during the Cold War. Some of it goes back a lot longer ago than that. The U.S. never invaded anywhere south of what is now Panama. So nowhere for all the invasions and occupations we've had in the Dominican Republic and Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua and some stuff in Panama, never south of what's now Panama. We never invaded Colombia or Brazil or anything else. And one of the closest opportunities we had was in 1891. We almost went to war with Chile. And the reason we almost went to war with Chile was Chile had some political upheaval, and the U.S. sent warships to show the flag, and then when you send ships someplace, you have to pull over and give everybody a few days of liberty and port call. And some enlisted sailors went out and got drunk and got in a bar fight. Actually, the fight was outside of the bar. Nonetheless, this almost led to war, right? The Chileans are going to remember this. In every Chilean naval history, this incident features. So we, the United States, need to know our dark history in order to not repeat the mistakes of the past. That's really important. Another piece of this puzzle that I think will help is that this language goes back to at least the 1950s. The U.S. talks about having a country team, which is that we have an embassy in a country, and whether we've got DEA or State Department or military folks, everybody's on the same team, everybody reports to the ambassador, and nothing moves, breathes, or operates in the country without the ambassador's approval. That's what it says on paper, and it's said that on paper since shortly after World War II. It has not always operated like that in practice, and a lot of the covert side of the story, that has been one of the problems, and we can Talk about the Nixon years, which were very special. So I think that practicing what we preach on that, having more interagency coordination, having more policy vetting and transparency, and then, hey, if the president wants to make a policy decision, that's the president's prerogative. But whether you look at, Bay of Pigs in 1961, how did we get some of these really boneheaded interventions that have had such blowback for the U.S. and the region? Much of that could have been circumvented with better staffing, better deliberation, and a more transparent process. So I think that will help. Great question.
We're getting close to time, so we can do this last question here, and then we can stay and chat after.
Yeah, I very much understand people needing to run to class. Support that.
First of all, great talk. Thank you so much. I was going to ask you to expand maybe on how the U.S. can promote stability with or build alliances, support our alliances with countries that are currently in crisis. So, for example, Venezuela and Guyana have their territorial dispute that is still ongoing, I believe. I know that the U.S. has our economic interests in the offshore oil drilling in that territory. So which alliance is the U.S. supposed to support long-term when those two alliances between Venezuela and Guyana are currently fighting?
Right. So I had the slide with the Rio Treaty, our partnership in Latin America going back to 1947. Some countries have exited, and Venezuela under Hugo Chavez was one. There was the brief episode in 2019 when the U.S. diplomatically recognizes Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. So his government in exile came back into that treaty. So technically, Venezuela's in the treaty because they're kicked out of the meetings that would allow them to leave the treaty. So yes, they're treaty allies, as are the Guyanese. What can we do? We can't do much with Venezuela right now. I think the Biden administration has tried dialing back sanctions in hopes of having a free and fair election and building some. That did not work. Venezuelan regime did not live up to the commitments that were offered. What can we do with Guyana? I think we're doing a lot. The Guyanese asked for help when it looked like Venezuela was saber rattling and trying to invade. Personally, my money was on there's never going to be an invasion. This is Maduro's saber rattling for domestic political boost by making this territory or reviving this territorial claim to much of Guyana's territory. So are we providing a lot of the training and equipment and security assistance to Guyana? Yes. Is Guyana a democracy and a sovereign country that we're protecting? Yes. On the other hand, it would feel a little less dirty to me if we had shown some love and attention to Guyana before the big oil discoveries that they'd had. So it looks like we're friends in sickness and health, and not just when you happen to trip and fall into several billion barrels of oil. So yes, there's things we could do, but I think having that long-term commitment would really help in terms of the values dimension. But as far as helping Venezuela, that is not just a military-to-military issue. That is the number one tragedy in the Americas, is the trajectory that Venezuela has been on. And there's just very limited things that the U.S. government can do to fix that problem now, sadly. Great question.
All right, let's thank